my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a What Have I Been Reading video, which is basically going to be talking about the books that I've read over the last 8 months, which is definitely a lot of books, but I am going to break it into 2 parts. So this part is going to be all of the audiobooks that I have read over the last 8 months, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the first one that I started 2024 with, and that is Black Brother, Black Brother by Jewell Parker Rhodes. This was narrated by Barrie Buckner. This is the story of a young teenage boy. I think he's around like 13, 14, and he is being bullied at school. He's being referred to as Black Brother because he presents as Black, but he has a brother who presents as white. This is being used by classmates and by his teachers, and he doesn't really feel like he has his own identity. And after an incident where his bully basically sets him up to be falsely accused of something, Dante, our main character, is suspended from school. And during this time, he joins a local youth community center where he meets this former Olympian fencer who agrees to train him during this time that he's suspended. And when Dante goes back to school, he is determined to defeat his bully, who is also the fencing team captain. This is a really great story. I think that it should definitely be required reading for the ways that Jewell Parker Rhodes approaches such serious topics and discussions about race and bullying and stories of resilience. In not just this book, but some of the other books I've read by her, I really feel like she is a foundational author for young adult literature, and this was just no exception to that. It was amazing. I wish it was required reading. I wish there was a little bit more development of characters, so I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, but still very highly recommend. The next book I read is Love in Winter Wonderland by Abiola Bello. This was narrated by Ben Bailey Smith and Nneka Okoye, or Okoye, I believe. And this is the story of 2 high school students who are nearing the end of their studies. One is Trey, our male main character, who is working for his family's bookstore that is starting to experience financial difficulties, and he is kind of balancing the responsibilities of his family, while our other main character is trying to basically save up money to do an art program, and she ends up getting a job at the bookstore to try and help them save their image, but also build up her savings for this program. I read this in January and I was kind of in the mood for like a cozy Christmas rom-com, and this delivered on all of that. I really enjoyed this. I loved the characters. I think that there's a really great development of their stories throughout this book. I will say that I was slightly disappointed with the series of events towards the end of the book. There was a trope that was used that I didn't really like, and I think it led to some really bad pacing issues towards the end. But this still gave me exactly what I wanted from it, and I'm still looking forward to reading more from this author in the future, so I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to Evil Eye by Etaf, and this was narrated by Vaneh, Assadourian, and Gail, Shalan. In Evil Eye, we meet our main character Yara, who up to the beginning of this book was living a life that she was really content with, but maybe not fully satisfied with. She was raised in a very conservative family that she has escaped from, and she was raised in a really conservative family that she doesn't really keep ties with, and she has a husband who she considers very modern and very accepting of the things that she wants out of life. She has her own professional career, she has 2 daughters that she loves very much, and things seem to be all right. After there's an experience at work where a coworker makes racist, microaggressive comments towards her, she ends up punished instead of the coworker, and this leads her into a spiral of re-examining her life and realizing that there are a lot of things that she has been suppressing and not really dealing with, and that she has this deep dissatisfaction with the way that her life has turned out. And this was a really heavy story. I did not expect this to be as intense as it was. There's a lot of discussion in this book about generational trauma and about violence in relationships, and this sense of like struggling between being content with circumstances that are very different to how you've been raised and provide a sense of security and the realities of what you actually want out of life and what is actually fulfilling to you. And I loved the exploration of this dynamic through marriage and motherhood that we get through Yara. This was a book club pick, and I really liked the discussions that came out of this book club pick. I think that there was a lot of different things that different people took away from this, depending on your phase of life, your experiences, and I really enjoyed it overall, even though it feels very bizarre to say that. Overall, I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. This was translated from the Japanese. This was translated from the Japanese by Louise Kawai, and it was narrated by Shen. This is about a high school student who has recently lost his grandfather, and he is getting ready to close his grandfather's bookstore when all of a sudden this cat appears and has these missions that he wants to take this teenager on to save books around the world, or worlds. I can appreciate that this book is a love letter to reading and to authors, and it had a really sharp social commentary on the publishing industry and the changing demands of readers, but I had a lot of issues with this book. I think my biggest issue was just that there's like no world building, and yet this has fantastical elements. Like, parts of the book that do have these fantastical elements almost feel like they're just these weird ways to interweave like very heavy-handed social commentary that I don't think was always really naturally interwoven into the story. I think a lot of the times it was just too much trying to be said in this book. And it's very direct, like it's very much telling you exactly what you should think and what you should believe. And I don't know, I also had issues with the only female character that we have in this book and how she's characterized. It was just really icky. And I find this issue a lot with Japanese translated fiction. That if there are female characters, they're described in very misogynistic ways or in ways that basically fail the Bechdel test because their whole personality revolves around the main character and either being a love interest to that main character or being obsessed with that main male character. I just found that to be an issue here as well, and it was really disappointing. So yeah, I just didn't really enjoy much about this book. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars, and I think that was honestly being kind of generous for how I feel about it so many months later. Next, I have Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers by Jessie Q. Sutanto. This was narrated by Eunice Wong. This was amazing. This is a cozy mystery following this woman named Vera Wong, who she's elderly. I think she's in like her 70s in this book. And she has kind of been isolated, and she kind of feels like she doesn't have a purpose anymore, but she still has this tea shop, even though it has been struggling. And so she's just living life day to day. She has a very strict routine. And one morning she wakes up and finds a dead body in the tea shop. And believing that she is a better investigator than any police officer or detective, she decides she will solve this murder. And so we end up following her, and I think we had 4 other characters. This book changed POVs based on like the characters Vera starts to suspect are involved in the crime. And that was really interesting because I think it was a really great way to round out the story, to give us background and insight into these characters without making it feel like info dumping. And it adds this really interesting atmosphere where you have Vera's theories, but you also have extra information that she doesn't have. And so the reader is able to form their own theories and kind of follow their own beliefs of investigation instead of solely being led by the investigator. And so yeah, it was really an interesting story. I also really loved in this how it explores the way that we often treat elderly people in society, and how like when society deems like, oh, you can retire, like you don't need to do anything anymore, it can be very isolating, and how oftentimes these people experience depression and other mental health issues that are exacerbated by this type of isolation and loneliness. And I loved the honest conversations that were had in this book about this, and also the ways that Vera like turns this into humorous circumstances. I just think it was really well done. And I'm so excited. I just recently found out that this will be getting a sequel soon. I cannot wait to read more of Vera's stories. And I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. This was literally one of my first favorites of the year. So good. Next, I listened to The Great Divide by Cristina Henriquez, and this was narrated by Robin Miles. This is essentially a story about the building of the Panama Canal, but focused on individuals who were living in Panama during this time or came to Panama during this time, and the real exploitation that was happening and the problematic nature of building this canal here. And I found this so interesting because I honestly don't know a lot about the history of the Panama Canal. We're taught very little about it, at least we were when I was growing up. But that was actually what led me to want to read this book. And I think the author does a great job of setting the tone and the atmosphere of this time period and what it was like for people living in this place, and yet also being a victim to like the circumstances of the political situation around this. However, I think this story was attempting to show too many perspectives. We have 4 main characters, but then from there we have a large cast of supporting characters that also get points of view in this story. And it became very convoluted with so many people's narratives, and it's jumping back and forth in time. Sometimes you're not really sure who exactly is talking, how they're related to someone else. It just became very confusing. And also for so many stories, I guess I expected them to come together in a better and more cohesive way. Some stories have these interconnected moments where you're like, oh, okay, like I see why this is like being shown. But then others, you're like, that was like so unimportant to the grand picture of like what was being talked about or like what was being built up to. I don't know, it all felt like it was too much. And I think that had this book focused in more on those 4 main characters and maybe not switched the point of view so often to these secondary characters, that maybe the story would have been a little bit more cohesive. So I ended up giving this one a 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna. This was narrated by Samara McLaren, and this follows the story of Nneka Moon, who is famous on social media for these witchy videos, but everyone thinks they're fake, when in reality, Nneka Moon is a real witch. She was orphaned as a child and raised by this society of witches who are very, very strict and want their magic to be kept secret. Nneka is living by this to the best of her ability, but one day a family sees her video and they approach her with an offer to become a tutor to these 3 young witches that they have in their care. Nneka at first is very hesitant about this, but they give her an offer that she can't really refuse. And through this journey of becoming a teacher to these young witches, she also discovers that the thing she's really been missing in life is a family and feeling like she belongs somewhere, and she is finally given that opportunity, but there are of course things that threaten the security of that. This was such a cozy romantic fantasy. I was so shocked by how much I loved this. The characters were great. I really loved the relationship aspect of this story as well. I liked that it didn't hinge on miscommunication, that there was this healthy dynamic instead of something toxic and draining to read from. I also loved the magical elements of this. I think that they worked really well with the story setup and that they made sense with like the world building that we're given. I'm really excited because the sequel to this one comes out in just a couple of months. I can't wait to continue on with this series. I think that one is like a companion novel. It's about like another witch in the society, which makes me even more excited to see more of this world. I give this one 5 out of 5 stars, and it's definitely a new favorite. Then we have Rana June and The One and Only Now. This was by Shide Etaf, and this was narrated by Rasha Zamamini. And this is the story of an Iranian-American teenager. It's set in Southern California in 1996, and she has just lost her best friend. And this is marketed as a YA contemporary. I don't think that this really qualifies as young adult. The characters are like 16, 17, 18, so still in young adult, but I found something really disturbing while reading this book is that there are very graphic sex scenes, and I'm talking like more graphic than the actual steamy romance that I was reading at the time that is marketed towards adults. And I found this really jarring in this book because it seems very odd to me that this is like so graphic when there are like very serious themes that do feel appropriate to young adult audiences, but they are like completely glossed over. There is no nuance to these, there's no real discussion. They feel very forced into the narrative and very much like, let's wrap this up in a bow as soon as possible. And it's a book that's supposed to be about mental health and grief and like finding a way to survive like the most devastating of things that can happen to someone. Yes, the main character is establishing her sexuality and like coming to terms with that, but it's the way that it's talked about in this book that feels almost like a sensationalization of that instead of like a genuine exploration. And also the really weird toxic relationship that she kind of develops in this was just, I was just kind of like, why is this young adult? This feels like those like early 20s books where like the main character's life is just like falling apart and it's a train wreck. But this is like a 16-year-old, and I can see the argument that like, okay, yes, like some of these things are realistic for 16-year-olds, but I also just don't really understand the desire to market this to young readers when I think that like the issues that should be approached with them are approached so poorly. I really did not like this book. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars when I first read it because there were some things that I enjoyed about like the 90s atmosphere, this feeling of nostalgia for this time period, and like the way that there were so many things that were yet to happen that like our main character like didn't know about but was like theorizing about and like thinking about like what would the next like decade of her life look like. But the more that I think about this, the more I think that maybe this really should have been a 1 star because I just had so many issues with it. So yeah, didn't enjoy this one. I wouldn't recommend it. Maybe I would recommend it to adult readers, but I don't feel comfortable recommending this to like younger readers. And I listened to What White People Can Do Next by Emma DeBerry. This was narrated by the author. This is a very short book that is looking at like modern activism and kind of dissecting the types of performative activism that happened in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the protests that happened not just in the United States, but also in countries around the world in reaction to this. And I found this really fascinating. I think Emma DeBerry has a very nuanced argument in the ways that people perform activism nowadays and how some of those are problematic and how we can really challenge the norms of these and encourage more discourse and conversation, and also promote more collective activism within like community building. This is a book that I've talked about so much since I finished reading it, both in like the book sphere, but also in like my personal life and with friends and things. And yeah, this was just a really great read. I think there were some sections that could have had a little bit more like fleshed out in it, but overall it was still really good. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and this has made me really excited to read more of Emma DeBerry's work. She's written a lot of different books on like sociocultural issues, and I really loved her writing style in this, so very excited to continue with some of her other books now. Next was The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon. This was narrated by Michael Gallagher and Raychan Lumeno. This is a enemies to lovers story about 2 main characters who are pretty dissatisfied with life. They have a lot of frustrations and a lot of responsibility. They don't really have friends or other people to talk to. And our male main character, Hart, accidentally writes a letter intending for it to be to his deceased friend, but Mercy ends up with this letter and they end up exchanging anonymous letters back and forth. Unknowingly, they're forming a friendship through these letters, while in real life, they really dislike each other because of the first interaction they had a few years before the events of this book. I will say that I really liked the first half of this book. I think there was a nice development of the characters, and I really liked the slow burn that this book was like beginning to develop. The second half took a nosedive. I didn't like how the romance was developing. I didn't like the lack of world building, because by that point I was starting to get more descriptions of things in the world, and I really did not understand so many aspects of this story. There's a lot of weird descriptions in this. Like, I can't even figure out what supposed time period this is set in, because there's like canned root beer, but like they don't have technology. And it was a very weird setting that I don't understand at all. And I'm really curious about the second book, because from what I've heard about the second book, basically the world building in that like contradicts parts of this book. So I have so many questions about what is going on. I did think that the characters had like an interesting development in the second half of the book, but there's some tropes that were used that I didn't really like, and I found the actual like meat of the story itself, like the real like plot in this, was lacking. It was underdeveloped. Yeah, I really struggled with this one. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to The Bandit Queens by Perini Schroff. This is the story of Gita, and 5 years before the events of this book, everyone thought that she murdered her husband, who was abusive towards her and an alcoholic, and there's like this whole lore in her village that she did this, and they're just like terrified of her now. But then there are some women who start approaching her, asking her to get rid of their husbands as well, and Gita kind of has to keep up appearances, and it involves these crazy shenanigans that transpire, and there are just so many characters that are so funny in this story, and it feels weird to say that because, like, obviously this book is looking at some dark themes, and even beyond like the main premise, there's a lot of sociocultural aspects to this story and the place that it's set in that are very dark and very sad. And I find it so interesting that when I think back on this book, I think about how much I enjoyed it, and I think that really Perini Schroff did an excellent job of balancing really serious issues with witty humor and this cynicism that we get from the main characters that just comes off really well. Yeah, I don't know, I just really love this book, and I think that it was also really interesting learning about the actual real bandit queen that this story is like partially inspired by, and getting that kind of historical background on a character that is not very well known in Western history. This was definitely a favorite of mine. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to You Don't Have a Shot by Raquel Marie. This was narrated by Marisol Ramirez. This is a queer YA summer romance set at a soccer camp where these two rivals from like competing schools are brought together and are forced to be on the same team and work together over a summer to basically like do these matches against other teams, and the teams that win the most, that like end up in like the finals, they are watched by scouts from major soccer programs across the United States. And there was something like so atmospheric about this book. Like, it reminded me of The Parent Trap, where like it's just like that summer camp setting that is so lovely. I really loved the characters in this one, especially our main character Vaneh. She is just one of those characters that you want to give a big hug to. There were a lot of times in this book where I was like, she is better than I would have been at that age, because there are so many times where she realizes the effect of intergenerational trauma on her life, and she actively makes a choice to try and overcome this and to communicate her feelings and work through her feelings instead of lashing out in anger. She genuinely is trying to be a better person, and I loved seeing that in this story, and especially at this age range. Yeah, I just really enjoyed this one. I loved the soccer aspect. It felt like a queer reimagining of Bend It Like Beckham, one of my favorite childhood movies. I think there were some elements, especially towards the end of the story, where there needed to be a little bit more development, and the pacing was just a bit off in terms of like what had built up to this. But I still give it 4 out of 5 stars. I would highly recommend it. It was a really fun read. Next up was Tastes Like Shakar by Nisha Sharma. This was narrated by Sunila Namkini and Vikas Adam. I was so shocked by how much I loved this. I was hesitant to pick this one up because of my experience with dating Dr. Dill, which was not good. I am really glad though that I gave this book a chance, because it was so much better than the first one. Like, there was just so much better writing, so much better development of characters. I also found the like relationship in this one to be much more mature and nuanced and reflective of real life relationships and the challenges that come with being adults and having different schedules, maybe living in different places. I really liked that aspect of this, and I just felt like this was much more fully formed than the first book. I didn't appreciate one of the storylines that was like a mystery element. I felt it was unnecessary, but overall still enjoyed my time with this one. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And I read A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. This was narrated by M. Grossland. This is the sequel to the first book, and it like directly follows the events of the first book, so I don't want to give like any information about it. I will say I didn't resonate with this one as much as the first book. I think just because slightly different themes were being explored. It's still like a cozy sci-fi. I still think that there are a lot of things in this that were really beautiful to read, but not as impactful as the first book for me personally. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan, narrated by Aoife McMahon, and I thought this book was going to be for me. It's about a woman moving overseas, working as an English as a second language instructor, and going through this like internal battle of like, was this move worth it? Do I really like this job? Like, what about this atmosphere, this country that I've moved to? Like, all of these things. Struggling to make friends, build relationships. I was like, oh my gosh, I will totally relate to this book. I really didn't. I will say I found certain parts of this book really interesting, like the examination of Irish and British sociocultural history and linguistics and things like that. I found that very fascinating. I didn't necessarily understand every aspect of those parts of the story because I definitely have a gap in my reading on Irish history, but I think that it's examined in a way here that still makes it easy to understand like the overarching themes. And I really liked how some of this was tied into like the experience of English as a second language teaching. It's very difficult to be in this field during a time of decolonization because there have been teachers who do promote English as like you have to learn this to like be a civilized person or like to be a successful person. And that's certainly not true. And so it's about how to approach that in a way that still reminds your students that their native language is important, that it will always be a part of their identity, their culture, things like that. I found the way that some of those topics were approached were really well done, but my issue with this book was that I hated the characters. Everyone was awful. I didn't like any of the characters. I didn't even think there was like one redeeming quality about our main character, because at a certain point I was like, girl, this is your life. You have to be responsible for it, and you doing this back and forth and like being just the messiest of people, and yeah, I couldn't do it. So I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. I think it honestly should be 1 out of 5 stars, but I'm giving it 2 stars for the more nuanced topics that it did approach in a well-meaning way. Then I listened to Our Wives Under the Sea by Julie Armfield. This was narrated by Annabelle Baldwin and Robin Holdaway. This is a really interesting blend of like literary fiction and science fiction. I don't really know what to categorize it as. It feels like a really genre-bending book, but it's the story of these 2 women who are married, and one of the women was a deep sea explorer who disappeared for months. It was supposed to be a few weeks on a submarine, and she disappeared for months. Her wife thought she had died. No one had contact with them. No one knows what happened when they were in the water. 3 researchers went down, only 2 came back up, and they're not really talking about what they experienced. The one wife is very happy to have her wife home, but she notices that her wife is different, and she doesn't really know how to talk to her, how to explain like the last few months of her life to her when her wife won't reciprocate that. And she tells you the story of like how they met and what she was doing in this time that her wife was missing. And it was very fascinating because it's almost like she's grieving for the life that she thought they were going to have with one another, but also grieving for the reality of that even now, when she should be so happy that her wife is back, she knows that they're not happy. She knows that something is wrong and her wife won't tell her. And it's this gap that they don't know how to bridge. So while you're learning that story, the chapters also alternate to the diary that the other wife kept while she was in the submarine. And each chapter is 1 day in that submarine. And so you slowly start to find out what happened. That was really interesting, seeing like the juxtaposition of like this life in this sea environment where they're also very much in the dark about what is happening. They don't understand why they can't contact people or why their submarine is stuck here, all of these things. And I loved the writing style in this. It is very literary. It is very much almost written in like a prose format that I found so incredibly intoxicating. It was so hard to stop reading this book. I truly ended up reading the entire thing in a day because I could not stop. I needed to know what happened next. And there's such a weird intensity and anxiety while reading this because you don't know what is happening next. You are kept in the dark just as much as the other characters are. It's building this tension up throughout the whole story. And that is actually my one criticism of this book, is that for all the tension and anxiety I felt while reading this, when it actually came to the big reveal, it was left in this ambiguous territory that I was just like, okay, why? Why did you build all this up to not really have an answer as to what happened? It's left to the imagination of the reader, and I don't like that. I think there needed to be a more concise explanation. Yeah, I was disappointed in that. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to Stoned by Aja Radin, and this was narrated by Justine Eyre. This is a nonfiction about the history of gemstones and how this obsession with gemstones shaped a lot of very pivotal historical events. I found this book interesting, but I have a lot of beefs with this type of nonfiction. There are a lot of very ambitious claims that this book sets out to like try to explain to the reader, and most of those claims don't have merit. A lot of them are stretching the truth or over exaggerating certain events or outright lying about the importance of some things. Like there's this whole thread of the story that's about Queen Mary and Elizabeth I, and they're like disagreeing about jewelry, and that is not the source of the issues that they have. It was so bizarre to me that this was even an argument. There are a couple sections that I found really interesting. Like, for example, there's a section on emeralds that talks about indigenous communities and how a lot of people make fun of indigenous communities for the way that they sold territory for beads, or like the way they use beads for things. And she talks about how beads were actually very valuable to these communities, and that and being unaware of the actual culture and traditions of these communities is the real problem here, and making fun of these communities for something that you don't understand makes you the ignorant person. I thought that was great. I think there were some interesting things in the diamonds and the pearl sections, but again, there were just so many claims in this that I was like, you don't have evidence to support that, and I don't understand why you're making those claims. So I ended up giving this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Oye by Melissa McGolan. This was narrated by Elena Ray. This is the story of the youngest daughter in a Colombian American family who at the beginning of the novel is going on a road trip with her mother, and her mother starts basically trauma dumping on her and telling her like the story of their family, and especially their grandmother Abwe, who is refusing to leave the area when this hurricane comes through. And we are getting this information through phone calls that Luciana is making to her sister Mari, who is away at college, and they're one-sided phone calls, so we only get Luciana's point of view. I think that was an interesting narrative choice. I understand why this approach was taken, but I think that it also was not the best, because sometimes it made certain information feel like info dumps when this information is being retold over the phone to the sister. There's also parts where it gets really confusing because there's like conversations happening in the phone call, but then there's also like conversations that have happened before the phone call, and there's like all these events happening. It was just a little confusing sometimes and disjointed. I also think that this type of narrative structure made it really hard to connect with the characters because we don't get a lot of character development, and really the only character that felt fully formed was Abwe. She is a larger than life character. We get so much of her life through the people that love her, and I think that was really interesting, but I wanted a little bit more from this. I don't think this was a bad book. I think that the narrative structure just didn't work for me personally. There's still a lot of parts to this book that I really enjoyed. I give this one 3 out of 5 stars. For a debut, I think it was a good debut. I will be interested to see what this author comes out with next because I did still appreciate her writing style. Then I read Your Driver is Waiting by Priya Guns. This was narrated by the author, and this is like a gender-flipped taxi driver where we meet our main character Damini, and she is a Sri Lankan rideshare driver in an unnamed Western country, and it's her experiences driving and being very aware of like the sociocultural implications of like the society around her and these protests that are happening in the city. And it's really an examination of like who gets to be an activist, and Damini is like especially aware of this because she's really struggling financially. She started this job because her father passed away and her mother has health issues that needs like constant care. And so this job gave her flexibility while also a way to earn money, but they're constantly behind on payments and they're really struggling even to afford like basic necessities. And so it's this discussion of like who has the time to be an activist really. And I think this was such a really well done story in terms of the sociocultural commentary that it's discussing. There's such a satirical nature to this story and like the way that it examines sociocultural and political issues. I also found it interesting that this was an unnamed country because I think that in many ways this is happening in a lot of countries, and I liked that kind of ambiguity here. I also found it interesting how we meet Damini's like community and the friends that she has, some of which are involved in activism and some of which just can't be involved because of different circumstances. There's this really tense buildup to this interaction with her friends that I found so well done in terms of how it was structured. The way that it plays out, I just think was phenomenal. I think it's one of those moments that a lot of readers are gonna be like, oh no, I know what's coming. And it's like a car crash, you can't look away. You know what's happening and you know it's gonna be bad, but oh my gosh, you just don't imagine how bad it's going to get. And I liked that the first half of the book was this really slow buildup and like this intensity that you know is coming. And then once that happens, the way this story propels forward and the high intensity, high speed that this story takes was so wild. I think it was so insane how this book like paced itself, because even though it was such a dramatic shift in pacing, I think it worked so well here. I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars, and I really enjoyed it. Then I read a poetry collection, The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On by Vaneh Choi, and this was narrated by the author. This is kind of a poetry collection about the downfall of democracy and living through times that feel like an apocalypse has to be coming. I did really like that Vaneh Choi acknowledges that for a lot of people in marginalized communities, it's felt like the apocalypse for much longer than how it is feeling for white people. For example, one of the early poems in this is about the apocalypse starting the moment that Christopher Columbus claimed that he discovered a new land. That was already a type of apocalypse for the people that lived through that experience. And I thought that poem was so incredibly fascinating. And it really set the scene for what this collection is about. It's exploring these different periods in time where these many apocalypses have happened and we have survived and had to go on, and the way that that shapes people and shapes cultures and countries that experience these things, and how there's still this spirit of resilience. And as dark and unsettling as this collection can be at times, I did find that there were so many stories like this where there's still that hope, that way of reminding people that we are so resilient and we don't even know the ways that we can be resilient in surviving so many things. And I think that small light at the end of the tunnel was just really well done. Some of the poems in this were more impactful than others, but overall I think the themes of this collection were really well explored, and there were a few favorites that I took away from this, so I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next I listened to Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong, and this was also narrated by the author. This is a nonfiction that I feel like should honestly be required reading. This is part memoir, but also part history of the Asian American experience and the many different facets of that, because obviously there are many different types of Asian Americans. I really loved how intersectional this collection was. There are a lot of books that are like this. There are a lot of books on this subject across different races, ethnicities, religions, etc. But I think the way that this really stood out for me was how intersectional it was, and how Cathy Park Hong really ties together so many different issues and the collective suffering of people, and how working together is always going to be better than working apart, and refusing to recognize someone else's marginalization doesn't make you less marginalized. There was just so much nuance to this, and there are so many things that I took away from this book. It was just so incredibly well done. I give this one 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it, and I have now become obsessed with trying to find Cathy Park Hong's poetry because I am convinced I will love that as well. Then I listened to Bad Fat Black Girl by Cecily Bowen. This is another nonfiction, and it explores some of the same themes as Minor Feelings, but in this book of being a queer, black, fat individual. And I loved the way that Cecily Bowen incorporated rap into this book. I think it was such a fascinating theory, this theory of trap feminism that she discusses, and how trap music affects feminism and shapes certain aspects of it within these types of communities. I think also, like Cathy Park Hong, so much of Cecily Bowen's life is in this book. There is such a vulnerability and an honesty that she presents to the reader, and it's unashamedly. She discusses so many aspects of her life. I found one of the most impactful ones to be about financial insecurity and how that shaped her experiences growing up, but also affected her into adulthood with trying to keep up with the Joneses and accumulating credit card debt, and then also how that impacted her decision to turn to sex work and the experience she had with that. And it's not only her own experiences, but she also ties it into broader societal issues and makes those connections that show like these are systemic problems. Like her experiences are not individual, her experiences are not a personal failing. A lot of these issues are tied to systemic issues that she has faced and that many other people face as well. I also really loved the discussions that she had about being a queer individual and building friendships and trying to build healthy romantic relationships, and the positivity that was infused in these stories as a reminder of like, even if you go through very difficult things or very dark things, there's going to be a time in your life where you will feel like you are in the right place at the right time with the right people to support you. And as I'm sure you've gathered by now, this was a favorite for me, 5 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to Infested by Angel Luis Colon. This was narrated by Lee Osorio. And this is the story of a teenage boy who moves with his mom, stepdad, and stepsister to a like apartment complex that's being renovated that his stepdad is going to like be running. And there are some creepy things that start happening and these bugs that keep showing up everywhere. For a horror story that involved bugs, I thought I was going to be very creeped out while reading this. I actually found this pretty boring. I didn't really like the story. I felt it was very predictable. I thought as soon as these certain characters were introduced, I was like, okay, that's the villain. I also didn't fully understand like the explanation of things, like how things came together. I think was very half-baked. It just really wasn't for me. I gave this 1 out of 5 stars, and I stand by that because I just did not get on with this book. Next, I listened to The Queer Principles of Kit Webb by Kat Sebastian, and this was narrated by Joel Leslie. This is the story of a highwayman who has retired, and he now runs like a coffee shop. And one day this lord comes in and asks to hire him basically to like rob his dad. And the highwayman is like, no, I can't, like I have a leg that I injured many years ago. I like can't help you with this, but I can show you like how to do it yourself. And so they form this friendship and connection over this, and they start really sharing a lot of their lives with one another. And it slowly develops into this really beautiful relationship between them. And I really loved especially that this book did not use miscommunication. These were both characters that were very open and upfront about their feelings. Even if they felt their feelings were selfish or maybe not entirely justified, they were able to talk about it and work through that. And I loved that in this story. I also loved our 2 main characters. I think both of them go on such a journey in this book that was really lovely to read and see this growth in them. There is a mystery subplot in this book that I feel like was a little bit underdeveloped. I really didn't care about it after a certain point, and so that could have maybe used a little bit more work. I was also a little bit disappointed that the ending of this book is basically all setting up the second book. I think I would have appreciated it if it had just had a little bit more closure to this story, but I of course want to read the second one now, so I hope that one has a better ending, because now my expectations are a little bit higher since this book hinged on the second book. But yeah, I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. It was a very fun read around a time where I was reading a lot of very dark poetry that you will hear about in my CLE challenge wrap up. But yeah, this was a nice, charming time. The last audiobook I have listened to in the past 8 months was The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. This was narrated by Gwendolyn Yo, and this is the story of 4 mothers and their daughters, and what started as a weekly mahjong meeting where they start sharing the history of their lives and why they decided to leave China, and ends up evolving into the story of their daughters and how their mother's influences and choices and histories impacted the daughters' lives in ways that they may not have been fully aware of. I thought this was a very beautiful book. I also find it interesting because I feel like this is more of a collection of short stories than a book, but I always hear it referred to as like a book or a novel. So that was a little bit unexpected for me, but I actually really liked that formatting. My only issue with this was that in the audio format, it was hard to tell the difference between the characters because the narrator did not have separate voices. And there was actually one character that I was fully convinced was never actually talked about in the book. And then I found out when I was watching the movie with a friend that I had merged like 2 characters together, and I went back to the audiobook. I like re-downloaded it from my library to like double check it. And I think why I was confused about it is because it doesn't clarify that it was a different person in the audiobook. Like the audiobook chapters are different to like the in-print chapters, at least in the copy I was listening to. So I think that was the issue. So that was also kind of annoying to me because I had confused like 2 people as one person in this. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. I still really appreciated it, and I'm very excited to finally say that I have read an Amy Tan novel. So that concludes all of the audiobooks I read in the last 8 months. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading. Bye!